Let's take a few minutes and let's debunk 7 myths that surround Asperger syndrome, otherwise known as high functioning autism, or just autism in general. Myth number 1 that we're going to debunk is this: people with autism tend to be savants. That is not true. What is a savant? Well, a savant is a person who is affected with a development disorder such as autism or intellectual disability rather, who exhibits exceptional skill or brilliance in some limited field such as mathematics or music. That is a quote from Merriam-Webster.com. So where do we get this idea? A lot of people think that if you have autism, well, necessarily you must have the special gift somewhere. This special savant ability, such as, I don't know, maybe you're good at playing the piano even though you can't do anything else. Or maybe you're good with numbers. Where does that come from? I think it comes from the media, by and large, popular media, entertainment media, specifically, the movie Rain Man. Remember that? Came out 20, 30 years ago. I love the movie. That's probably the only movie I actually watched more than twice. Yeah, I think it's a good movie. So, Dustin Hoffman played the role of Rain Man, whose real name was Raymond, but when his brother was little, he couldn't say Raymond, so he called him Rain Man, and that's what they named the movie. Well, Rain Man was low-functioning autistic, but he was also a savant. He could count cards. That's a very useful skill, by the way. Now, Raymond in the movie couldn't price a candy bar. So he had these skills that were highly advanced, but other skills or absence of skills, therefore he was not advanced. That's where we get that idea. And I know people say, the real life character that upon which that movie was based was not autistic, and I understand that. But the whole idea of the movie was suggested that Raymond was autistic, and so that's where we get the idea that people with autism are also savants. I've known people who have autism. I know people with autism. I don't know any of them who are savants, who have that special skill. Maybe they do, and I just don't know it, but I don't know of any. Number 2 is this. There is a myth out there that people with autism, people with even high-functioning autism, tend to have, just the opposite. They tend to have a low intelligence. So to be autistic is to not be too smart, not be too bright, not be too intelligent. The fact of the matter is, people with high-functioning autism, it's what the term means, high-functioning. That's why we differentiate between high-functioning and low-functioning autism. Those are terms, by the way, that we need to keep. I know there's a movement on that wants to get rid of those terms, wants to get rid of the term Asperger syndrome. Personally, now we need to keep them because we need to correctly diagnose people, and we express diagnosis through terminology. So we need to keep terms that correctly diagnose people, unless you don't believe in IQ. I mean, there's some people, very smart people, who don't believe in IQ, even though they have a very high IQ. But they think intelligence is somehow a social construct. I'm going to stay centered. I'm going to focus on reality. I'm going to be science-based. You follow whatever ideology you want. I'm not into ideology on this channel. I'm not into politics. I'm not into religion. So I'm here to tell you that there are people with high-functioning autism and people with low-functioning autism. Some people are in the middle, and the way that we distinguish one from the other is kind of arbitrary, but we cut it off at the IQ of 100. So if you have an IQ of 100 or more, you're high-functioning. If you have an IQ of 99, or I should say under 100, you're considered low-functioning. And so someone with an IQ of 99, 100, you probably can't tell the difference because, IQs fluctuate slightly, so it could change day to day, right? But still, we need to draw the line somewhere, and that is the arbitrary line where it is drawn. Low intelligence, people with autism, some of them, have extraordinarily high intellects. In fact, some of the great inventors throughout history, even today, are autistic. Number 3, myth that needs to be busted is that people with autism lack empathy. People with high-functioning autism lack empathy. It's kind of true that we lack the presentation of what is typically called cognitive empathy. And that is best understood as the ability to read nonverbal communication, nonverbal cues. For example, there are some people who are autistic. They see somebody who is sending them very strong signals that they are angry, but they're not picking up on that. Or that they are sad, and they're not picking up on that. Or that maybe they are infatuated with this person. Have the googly eye love thing going on, and they're not picking up on it. That can be really challenging. That can be a real problem. But there are some people who just lack cognitive empathy. But when we think of empathy, usually we think of a different kind of empathy. We think of affective empathy or affection. So we say people with autism don't demonstrate or present as being affectionate, therefore, they must not be affectionate. They must not have affection. I do. I don't show affection because, well, number one, I don't like to be touched too much, and I don't like to be hugged. My wife can hug me all she wants, but, if I don't know you, don't walk up and hug me, please. You want to give me a handshake? I prefer a fist bump. You want to straighten my collar? Let my wife do it. I don't know why, but those signs that are usually associated with affective empathy or affection, those are very bothersome to me, and people can misread that as saying, this guy doesn't have affection, so he lacks empathy. No, that's a myth. Let's debunk that right now. Number 4 is that meltdowns, and temper tantrums are basically the same thing. No, they're not the same thing. What is the difference? Well, a tantrum tends to be voluntary. Somebody throws a temper tantrum because, well, they're mad and they want to demonstrate or express, well, it's body language. We talked about that. So think of a tantrum as severe nonverbal communication, even though you may express it verbally. You might cuss somebody out, cuss somebody out. Or you may flip them off, whatever. That's body language, right? That's nonverbal communication, and that's voluntary. I don't know anyone who flipped somebody off involuntarily. Just couldn't help it. My hand just flew up and the middle finger went up and, it was a meltdown. But actually a meltdown is something that is involuntary. You don't do it by design. In fact, you don't even want to do it. It's kind of embarrassing and it can get you into trouble, particularly if you're in an airport. But you have a meltdown because there are pressures. People with Asperger syndrome have a meltdowns because there are pressures. Sometimes those pressures are social pressures. Sometimes they are external stimulus like lights, sounds, whatever. And sometimes, social pressure I think is a really big one where they're rejected and abused. And finally, they don't do it on purpose. They just kind of, they have a meltdown. I was going to say they explode, but I think that's maybe over the top. But again, just to reemphasize, people with Asperger syndrome typically don't like to have meltdowns. So think of it, this is probably not a good example, a good analogy, but think of it as hiccups. That's involuntary. You don't do it, I just think I like to hiccup for a while. I don't know anyone who does that, but you can't help it. So think of a meltdown maybe as like a really, really severe hiccup. I didn't do that on purpose. I just did it. I didn't want to do it. It just came out. Sorry, apologize. Effectively, that is, again, that's not the best analogy, but that's kind of what a meltdown really is, at least in the sense of being involuntary. Number 5 myth that we need to debunk is that autism, high-functioning autism, Asperger syndrome, none of those things are a disease. They're not an illness. They're not a mental illness. They are not ordinary. They are not typical. They are a disorder. So if something is not ordinary, then it is a disorder or disordinary. So that is what autism is. Not a mental illness. You can't catch it from anybody. It's not a disease, It's, you don't sit next to somebody at the bus who is autistic. Next thing you know, now I'm autistic. That's not the way it works. So how does it work? Well, it begins in your prenatal stage. It is probably related to genetics. That is to say, you inherit it. And you can't get a cure for it. It's always going to be there. So if you were born autistic, When you die, live to be 100, 120, whatever, you're still going to be autistic. It's not a disease. There is no cure for it. There is no cause for it in the sense of a disease that you can catch, communicable disease. That is not there. How do you understand that? How do you explain it? The way that I explain it is that red hair. Well, we could say that's not ordinary, so it's disordinary, or it's a disorder. There's nothing wrong with it. I mean, I kind of like red hair, but because it's not ordinary, we can say, well, it's a disorder. Same thing, we talked about this in a video, I think, yesterday. Same thing with having blue eyes. I had blue eyes, I think. At least last time I checked my driver's license, it said I had blue eyes, but, your eye color typically doesn't change. I think maybe it can as you get older, but maybe some subtle changes, but it doesn't change. So autism doesn't change. It's a disorder, not an illness. There was this guy who lived back in the 19th century. His name was Agnes McAskill. And he was an extremely, extremely tall man. And he didn't have any kind of medical condition. Like some people, they have a problem with a pituitary gland dysfunctioning, and so their growth hormone is out of control, so they grow very tall. He didn't have that. He's just tall. According to Wikipedia.com, which I'm looking at right now, he grew to be 7 feet and 9 inches tall. Now, this is back in the 19th century when people were what? The average male was maybe 5.5 feet. I'm guessing maybe 5'9" at the most. So this guy, he was tall for our generation, but he was even taller back then. There is absolutely positively nothing pathologically wrong with this guy. He's just tall, So people with Asperger syndrome, there's really nothing wrong with us. But we just have this disorder. We are just the way that we are. Just like some people have red hair, some people have blue eyes. Some people are short, some people are tall. Some people have different bone structure. It's pathological in the sense that it is just natural, just normal. It's not something that you acquire, and it's not something that can be cured. Now, you can treat it if you want to. I guess you can treat red hair by dyeing your hair. I guess you could treat blue eyes by putting on contact lenses. I guess you could treat excessive tallness. I don't know how you do that. Maybe you'd stoop over or something. I don't know. Maybe you can't treat it. But no, it's not a disease. It's not an illness. And we absolutely positively have to underscore this rather. Autism is not a mental illness. It is a disorder. We're not ill. We're not sick. We're different from neurotypical people, and they are different from us. It is a disordinary. It is a disorder. Number 6. There are some people who believe that autism is a childhood disorder, and I can understand why they would come to that conclusion. It's because if you Google the term autism, what comes up are all these websites that are addressing childhood autism, and I think the reason for that is because parents are concerned, and they should be if they're good parents, because they know that their child is going to be a square peg in a round hole, or maybe a round peg in a square hole. I never could get that right. But they're going to have certain challenges that neurotypical children do not, and they want to make sure their kid has the best life they possibly can. And so sometimes they turn to the internet for advice, and that's a good place to turn. You also need to talk to a professional, I believe, but a good place to start usually is getting some background information on the internet. That takes us to myth number 7, and that is people with Asperger syndrome or autism tend to be violent. Same thing as, the very first thing we talked about, savants. They get it from the same place, and that is the media. So there is this mass shooting somewhere, and the media will say that this person had autism. People just connect the two. The fact that violent people tend not to have mental disorders. Believe it or not, violent people are not particularly mentally ill. People with mental disorders commit less violent crimes. But again, autism is not even a mental disorder, even though people think that it is. But because the media will report that a mass shooter had autism or Asperger syndrome or high-functioning autism, that he was somehow mentally disabled, which he wasn't, at least not due to Asperger syndrome. And they relate that. They relate the violence to autism, and so they just draw the conclusion without even thinking about it because they don't have any other information. I mean, what else would they do? So they just connect the two and they draw a conclusion that is the wrong conclusion. Autism is not a precursor to violence, and most people who are violent don't have autism. Now, before I understood autism, I had it. I didn't know I had it. I didn't understand it. Before I really understood Asperger syndrome, I was an Aspie. I didn't know it. I didn't even know what it was. But I did know someone who claimed to have Asperger syndrome. This guy was kind of obnoxious. I mean, he was likable, he was a friend, but he had this edge to his personality, and he offended a lot of people. You know, they talk about people who don't have a filter. They say things out of line that offends people. So I just drew the conclusion that that must be what Asperger syndrome was. It's like, you know, tolerable obnoxiousness. That's the way I figured it. But then, just out of curiosity, I started studying autism. I started studying Asperger syndrome. And as I came to understand what it really was and how it is defined, you know, according to psychologists, DSM-5, I realized, man, that is describing me. That was a revelation. So I was kind of self-diagnosed, but I really wasn't, because I wasn't certain. So I said, I'm going to find a therapist who specializes in autism and Asperger syndrome and high-functioning autism, and I'm going to set an appointment, see if I can get in and talk to her. Or him. It turned out to be her. And so I went in for an evaluation. Actually, it took several sessions. And the outcome was, yeah, you're full-blown autistic. You're a full-blown person with full-blown autism. Well, full-blown, I was actually about 150 pounds at the time, but you know what I mean. Full-blown autism. See those two rectangles on the screen? Let's keep talking if you want. Just click one of those two rectangles. The conversation will continue. If not, thanks for stopping by, and talk to y'all later.